Now let us turn our attention, if I may, to the second component of this work, the human condition. Once again, if we look at this work, Ningen no Jouken, the human condition, as a work that is made up of three installments or three parts, we had a brief discussion of the earlier part one of this three-part construction. And now let us turn our attentions to the second part. The second part is from the viewpoint of the six-part structure made up of parts 3 and 4, and these were released in the tail end of 1959. And so this is considered also as a work from 1959, as was the earlier part. And it is a continuation, a direct continuation of the story of Kaji that we saw and that we were engaged in, and that and it picks up where the first part left off. Now, the second part now deals with the same Kaji, but in a different dynamic, in a different set of circumstances and situations. Before, as you recall, he was in the situation of being, it was wartime, but it was a situation of being or having been able to receive an exemption from military service. And in order to do that, he was in essence, a type of civilian life, but it was a civilian life and work life that was obviously and very directly related to the wartime efforts. And it had a number of very devastating consequences, both psychologically and also in terms of one's moral stance. And so now what we have is the same Kaji, the same character, but now turning our attentions to his military service, because now we have not the civilian mode, but now we have him as a soldier, as a member of the army. And to be specific, we have, in a sense, the first half, or the first part of this, being his efforts and his story, or his meeting with certain people as he is engaged in, or as he is the subject of military training, basic training of sorts. And we see in this first half the way in which his viewpoint and his worldview about a type of what could be described, or what has been described as a type of left-leaning viewpoint that he would consider to be espousing a sense of the humane and a sense of having feelings of sympathy and empathy even towards one's quote-unquote enemies. And how this also translates itself into a type of utopian view of socialism, and therefore a utopian view of Soviet Russia, or potentially anyway, in terms of theoretical conversations at the least, a type of a utopian view. So that is one aspect that we saw from the earlier work, or the earlier component, and now we see the same Kaji with those same views, but they are further challenged here in the context of his military training and his life as a soldier, because we see, first of all, we do see how within the levels of authority and power that we see displayed even in the context of military training, we see how these views, these so-called views that are looked down upon and derided as being sympathetic to communism, we see how these views are treated by other figures within the military, other soldiers who seem to be mocking of this, and that mocking might turn even more serious and more deadly depending on the situation and circumstances. And so here we have, I think, a melding or a combination within this first half of the second part anyway. We have the beginnings, if you will, or a continuation of the way in which people in authority seem to be changed or altered because of their positions of authority. And whether those changes are good or bad, it really, the plot brings us forward to those conclusions. And we see how these positions of authority turn to abuses of authority. And those abuses of authority seem to have many sources, one of which, arguably, is the generally held view within the characters in this particular training camp about so-called communist sympathetic views. And so that is one component that could be said to be sowing the seeds of challenging or doubting the general viewpoint that was held by Kaji earlier in the cycle of the human condition. So that's one thing. And of course, this becomes very, very important as we carry through to the end of the second part, because we not only see Kaji in training, we will also see him as a soldier on the field, as it were, and it is a very frightening and terrifying ordeal or set of ordeals that he and his fellow soldiers have to deal with in certain circumstances. And so, and in those situations too, his viewpoints, his worldview will be undoubtedly challenged, and perhaps even to the point of a near breaking point, perhaps. But so that's one aspect that is carried over, but that is also perhaps further developed because of the changing circumstances that we see Kaji in this work, the second part. Another level, of course, is the idea of the aspect of the application of humane viewpoints, but how even in the efforts or in the endeavor to try to establish a sense of a type of morality in these very difficult situations, every choice that is made has its consequences, and the cause and effect relationship of these choices can lead potentially to some pretty significant consequences indeed. And those consequences, especially in wartime, especially in the military training context and also in the battlefield, can have very, very dire consequences indeed, life and death situations. And so Kaji is directly involved in those, or he's oftentimes either directly involved in this, or he is a witness to this. And I say oftentimes, I should correct myself, it is actually pretty much all the time. He is either directly involved in terms of the choices that he makes, or he is witness to the choices that are made by others, and he therefore sees the effects that are caused by such choices, even if they were whether they were made by him or whether they were made by others that he witnesses. And based on the consequences, then we see his reaction and how he tries to deal with those consequences. And it is his reaction, too, that lends a further level or dimension to how he's trying to deal with the moral complexities and dilemmas that are confronting him during this time, and how he therefore tries in a way to establish a sense of justice on the one hand, or if he sees that attempt to establish justice to be a futile effort, how he tries to deal with the sense of futility and what it is he reverts to, or what it is he relies on in order to try to mete out a sense of justice, or it could be also called a sense of revenge, or it could also be a sense of a type of rage, if you will. And if that is the case, is that justified on a moral ground, or is it immoral? And that, again, leads to yet further complications of the context of the dilemmas that he faces, that he has been facing from the very beginning, and now that he continues to face, because he is now seeing the consequences of wartime firsthand. Yet another level that is related to Kaji in the context of the second part in a very stark and very shocking way is his viewpoint on wartime. And as we have gathered from the earlier part, there were very strong indications that perhaps he, for certain reasons, was one that could have espoused the idea or the belief of pacifism for certain reasons, but due to circumstances that were facing him at the time, he was in the situation that he was in that led to the events of the story of part one, and then those events lead to where he finds himself in part two. And so that turn, that character arc development from where he was at the very start of part one to where he is at the start of part two is very shocking. And that turn indeed is very ironic, and it is also filled with a lot of potential sadness and tragedy. But he deals with it in the way that he, Kaji, is capable of, based on his own humanity and based on his own life experiences. This also means, of course, that we will have to see him confront his notions of how to deal with violence and how to deal with the issue of killing and how to deal with the issue of authority, and whether it is indeed possible for him to maintain a sense of the humane viewpoint while being a soldier in this particular situation that Kaji finds himself in, not just in military training, but also in the field as a soldier, because we also see him in various circumstances, meeting and re-meeting people that he might have met from earlier parts, and we see him commanding or leading a group of men or group of soldiers, also having to deal with the intense pressures of authoritarian figures or authority figures, and also having to deal with the terrible tragedies of battle, because we do also see battle here, and it is very grim, it is very bleak, it is very intense indeed. Even in those intense moments, we see Kaji as a soldier, and this becomes one of the powerful ironies of the human condition. We will see a number of these other ironies appear. Now, we have seen them before, and we will see them in subsequent parts, of course. But one of the most powerful ironies is the idea of Kaji and his viewpoints towards the wartime efforts from the first film, which could be said to be, in a way, a type of some people might have criticized it as being a type of naive attempt at grasping at a sense of pacifism in the first part. But now he is here a soldier, and he is a soldier who is not just trained, but he is trained to kill. And he's not just trained to kill to defend himself, but he perhaps is trained to kill, or perhaps is going to act on that ability in ways that will frighten even himself. And so in this way, we have a viewpoint or an examination of Kaji, the character, and already we see so many challenges to his worldview from the start of the cycle here to the second part that really can be said to be a complete 180 in terms of actual, say, narrative or plot design anyway, or plot points. A complete 180 to where he was at the start of part one. Here he is at arguably on the other side of the coin in terms of his viewpoint and how he has to deal with that moral conundrum, and whether he is successful or not by the end of this part. And indeed, we see him having to make a number of choices as a soldier that are terrifying, that are absolutely terrifying, because it could mean life or death, not just for the people who are affected by those choices, but for him as well, for Kaji as well. And so this part, the second part, is so crucial and so important in the arc of the discussion or the examination of Kaji the character, because we see him in a different set of circumstances from part one. Now we see him in training and also as a soldier, which is in many ways antithetical to a number of the characteristic traits that we saw established early on. We also see the effects of this psychologically and emotionally vis-a-vis his relationship with Michiko, and how that relationship between him and Michiko is expressed in this film. It is done in a very interesting and provocative way, and we get a sense of the insurmountable feelings of tragedy and sadness that both of them feel, even though they have these feelings towards each other. And I really admire this too about the work, Kobayashi's work, how the work focuses in on this relationship, the Kaji-Michiko relationship, and it gives us the sense of a type of a poignant grandeur of melodramatic love story in cinema, which is very poignant and very much part of who Kaji is and who Michiko is. It also serves as a type of metaphor, if you will, for the terrible effects that wartime had on an emotional and psychological level, even in civilian life that we saw in part one, and also in terms of the military life that we see here in part two. And those effects, I think, will have these very haunting, echoing ramifications as we go forward from this part into the final part, part three of the human condition. And so therefore we have a lot of new characters that we meet, and from those new characters the soldier aspects and the training aspects come into play. And we also see how Kaji's anger and how his sense of frustration towards these systems which seem in his eyes, and in fact the eyes of us the viewers, how these systems that he is a part of or he is subjected to, how these systems are filled with injustices. And so this becomes in many ways a very heated and critically trained eye on the day-to-day, the daily grind, if you will, of the application of the imperialism and militarism of Japan during this time. And so this is undoubtedly a very sharp and very pointed criticism of the power complexes of Japan during this period. And we see as a result the frustration and anger of Kaji towards these various systems as they manifest themselves in the specific episodes that we see, and the human related results that occur because of these systemic and systematic episodes, I think is something that is both haunting and shocking and tragic. And that feeling of haunting and shocking and tragic senses, I think, expresses itself so vividly and so powerfully in the performance of Tatsuya Nakadai as Kaji. This is therefore a film where, like the earlier film, we as viewers are with Kaji, and that makes the film, the human condition overall, even more shocking, because we are with him from the beginning and we are with him here in the middle part. And in this middle part we do see choices that he needs to make that either way will lead to some very potentially dark and dangerous places indeed. And so the fact that we are with him even during this time or these times makes watching the human condition, for instance the second part, very harrowing and very complex indeed. This is a continuation, or this is yet another example of the brilliance and the profound sense of the scope of the tragedy, how Kobayashi is able to show us the very fundamental level of Kaji as a human being, but how all those choices that he is witness to or that he himself is involved in, how everything has a type of effect, and that effect can echo all the way to the levels of the conflict that are global and that deal with different political systems and that deal with Japan's place in the world during this time, its view of itself during the imperialism and militarism of Japan during wartime and prior to wartime, in fact, as well. But and how Kobayashi and company are looking at this with a very, very harsh, critical eye, and seeing all the absurdities and all the ironies and all the hypocrisies that are part of the authoritarian system as set forth in this second component, part 2 of the human condition, and how that is affecting Kaji, who is, in a sense, every person. And the fact that he does not escape unscathed in terms of the moral examination that he is confronting, or he is confronted with. The fact that he does not escape unscathed makes for yet a further understanding or further reminder of just how complex and how difficult and how truly terrifying these dilemmas are during this particular time, as expressed here in the second part of the human condition. Now let us turn our attention to the supplements that can be found on this Disc 2, which accompanies the second component or second part of this overall work, The Human Condition. As with Disc 1, Disc 2 has its own set of supplements. In terms of quantity, we only have 2, a trailer and also a discussion interview, but just like with the previous disc, this Disc 2 set of supplements is spectacular, and it's really excellent for the reasons that I'll try to explain. So first up is a one-on-one interview with filmmaker Masahiro Shinoda, and this is dated from 2009. It is approximately 24 minutes. This is carried over from the earlier DVD release from the Criterion collection. And I am so glad they did that, because this is a marvelous interview that Shinoda gives. It is an appreciation, and also it is highlighting the many significant and relevant points of Kobayashi's background and biography and career that are relevant to, say, a discussion of the human condition. And Shinoda delivers his comments so masterfully and so convincingly. He has obviously a really excellent grasp over the material. He knows the materials inside and out, and you can tell because there is a passion and there is a real gift for precision in terms of Shinoda's comments. This is a splendid interview. Please check it out if you can. He goes into many details. For instance, he speaks about his great admiration for the work, The Human Condition, and about how it was, in Shinoda's terms or his expressions, on the one hand, a work dealing with these grand, big, lofty ideals and ideas. And this is one of the powerful things about the work, about how it is talking about or discussing Japan and its position during the war, but its position on a sort of global, international front, on the one hand, which, according to Shinoda, was very much a unique thing in the context of Japanese cinema during the late 50s and early 60s, because, again, from the perspective of Shinoda, there was a lot of endeavors in Japanese cinema, great endeavors in terms of the drama, the family drama. But here, therefore, we have Kobayashi presenting the world in Japanese cinema with these examples of films, The Human Condition, or these works based on the writings of Gomikawa that were attempting to explore and attempting to engage with the idea of Japan on the international stage. Again, it's wartime Japan, of course, but still, it's the idea of Japan and its engagements with various members outside of Japan. And so this is therefore, in that sense, a type of different take or different path of Japanese cinema, one that is not dealing necessarily with, say, family dramas or the sort. This is, again, the expression of Shinoda. And so here we have Shinoda's way of indicating to us just how strong and how forceful the artistry of Kobayashi cinema really was in the context of the contemporary Japanese times as well as modern day. So it's a very forceful and profound statement or set of statements from Shinoda on this front. And he's talking about the real key importance and significance of this work in terms of showing Japan as a defeated nation. This is, again, Shinoda's expression. The power and the tragedy of seeing Japan and various aspects of the Japanese people as shown through or refracted through the experience of the character of Kaji, the Tatsuya Nakadai character, and his various experiences from civilian life and civilian work to his time in the military and outside, and what happens to him and the conclusions that confront his particular character arc. And so this is very much a statement or a series of statements about Japan as a defeated nation and the ways in which Japan is trying to confront this type of status, not just in Kobayashi's exploring these particular stories of wartime Japan, but also the way in which one views these films or this work as a whole in post-war Japan, in post-war Japanese cinema. So this is also very important. Also, we return, or Shinoda reminds us of the various details of Kobayashi's life. And he reminds us, for instance, about how Kobayashi served in the military, and there was the opportunity for Kobayashi to take the relevant officer's exam to become an officer and to rise in the ranks, as it were. But Kobayashi refused. He refused to take this, and he was it was a type of protest, as it were, because according to Shinoda, Kobayashi wanted to remain in the rank of private, which he did, according to his biographical account. And this is, according to Shinoda, a means by which Kobayashi was, in a sense, protesting the wartime efforts of Japan during this time. And also, and this is a great link too between Kobayashi and the author Gomikawa, this is a means by which Kobayashi would therefore experience the hardships and trials and tribulations and the tragedies of war and the real cruelties and horrors of war from the perspective of the private rank. And this therefore meant that for Kobayashi there was no sense of class distinction. Those were diminished in favor of experiencing the war just as other people that were a part of his generation were experiencing it. And this is very true also for Gomikawa. And so therefore this has a type of class distinction or lack of distinction, at least as far as how Gomikawa and Kobayashi wanted to share in that experience. If a certain class of people were to be confronted with the horrors of war, then it was only from Kobayashi's viewpoint and Gomikawa's viewpoint, it was only a sense of it would be unfair if Kobayashi would be able to rise in the ranks through the officer system. And so he refused that, according to Shinoda. And I think that type of approach does emerge in the work, The Human Condition. We see the ways in which ranks are associated with authority within the military systems. We also see the way in which Kaji tries to sympathize or empathize with the positions of the soldiers that, for instance, are under his authority or control, or the laborers that are under his authority or control. There are efforts and endeavors that he makes in order to try to be with them and to be unified with them and with their efforts. Do those efforts by Kaji succeed all the time? Arguably, they do not, and that forms the basis for the plot as it progresses through the entirety of the human condition. But all the same, those feelings and sentiments are certainly there, and I think that is, at least according to the way that Shinoda is presenting it, that is the way in which the idea of empathy and the idea of the diminishment of class distinctions are at the heart, or are one of the key points of this work, and they are a reflection of Gomikawa and Kobayashi and their own biographical points. This is a really important point that Shinoda brings up. The idea of the experience of the common soldier, as it were, according to Shinoda, as expressed through Kaji's story and also as reflecting Kobayashi's story and Gomikawa's story. And also, Shinoda continues with this great conversation about the idea of the way in which this pre-war leftist intellectualism and egalitarianism, as Shinoda puts it, was really challenged and confronted in terms of the experiences, the horrors of war that were experienced by Gomikawa and by Kobayashi, that led to the impulses that drove a work like The Human Condition, both in terms of writing and in terms of the cinematic incarnation. And Shinoda reminds us about Kobayashi's own personal wartime experiences, being captured in Okinawa, and his experiences with the American-run prisoner of war camp, and how, according to Kobayashi, those experiences that he had were very, very different from those that he heard about in terms of the POW camps in China or in Siberia or in places that were run by the Soviet-Russian forces. And so this led to the way in which the work like The Human Condition would deal with and tackle the idea of the utopian ideal of socialism as espoused by or believed in by Kaji and some of his friends in the film, and how this is a reflection of what Kobayashi and Gomikawa and others may have believed pre-war, and their own and the intellectual and the intelligentsia classes that were also very much devoted to this ideal, and how this was challenged, and perhaps how this notion was somehow upset in the way in which the war progressed and in their own experiences with the war. And we will see this played out, I think, in very vivid and graphic and quite powerful detail when we get to the third part of this cycle. So this is a very important point, and it leads also to Shinoda's conversation about how he views Kobayashi's take via The Human Condition in terms of the absurdity of war. And also, from Kobayashi's viewpoint, the text, the Gomikawa text of The Human Condition, was very important. And so, in terms of the faithfulness, according to Shinoda, the work, the cinematic work, The Human Condition, is very faithful to the underlying text source material of Gomikawa. In this way, too, Shinoda reminds us about how this film, this work, The Human Condition, is very much also, I think, a reflection of many of the personal experiences of Kobayashi as a soldier. So, for instance, there is, according to Shinoda and his great observations, there is a lot of walking, there is a lot of concern about food and rationing, and also this idea of a journey, of a type of journey throughout this wartime landscape. In Shinoda's words, which is a brilliant concept, this film is in many ways a type of road movie with a lot of motion, a lot of forward motion, a lot of walking, a lot of wandering, etc. And in that, and finding food and struggling to maintain a sense of command and control, etc. And so this is, I think, giving us a sense of how accessible these elements are when one is watching the film, even if one is watching it outside of the general context of the immediacy of post-war Japanese cinema. There are still these elements that make it very universal and accessible, the human aspects. And there's also this great way that Shinoda describes the work of Kobayashi here, the human condition. I alluded to it earlier, which is the idea of the grandeur of the broad macro level, as well as paying attention to the brilliant way in which Kobayashi is able to pay attention to the minutia of the intimate and the micro level. And this is, I think, expressed, for instance, in the relationship between Michiko and Kaji. And this also gives the opportunity for Shinoda to address what could also be seen to be maybe one of the criticisms of the work, especially from, according to Shinoda, from modern day audiences. That is the seemingly, say, melodramatic or overly melodramatic aspect of the relationship between Kaji and Michiko. As we know, this is a key aspect of Kaji's character. It carries through throughout the entirety of the cycle, throughout the entirety of the work, from the very beginning all the way to the very end, as we know. And so Shinoda takes the opportunity to address this point, and he says, I think in a very eloquent way, he says how this is a really great reflection of Kobayashi as a filmmaker, and also his inclinations and also his viewpoints and perspectives, Kobayashi's, on the notion of romantic love and how he came from this tradition as an artist. Perhaps in terms of Shinoda's generation of artists and filmmakers and filmgoers, according to Shinoda himself, he probably would have expected to see maybe more of, say, the presentation of the love story in terms of erotic terms or the sensual. However, Kobayashi does treat it in terms of the dramatic and the romantic, although there are moments of haunting eroticism that also are on display in terms of the relationship between Michiko and Kaji. And this, I think, is an expression of the emotional needs and also what might be called the physical needs or the carnal needs that are also being affected by the wartime situations that Kaji and the others find themselves in. So I think it's actually a very complex portrayal of this relationship that Shinoda alludes to, which is, again, another brilliant example of the Shinoda discussion. And what is so great too is Shinoda talks too about how this film, Kobayashi's work, The Human Condition, is very much like the trajectory of a filmmaker like Jean Renoir and the film Grand Illusion. And so the idea of using these metaphors or using these stories as a way of criticizing war, a type of what might be referred to as an anti-war film. And in Shinoda's eyes, and in the eyes of many others, this work, The Human Condition, is often regarded as one of the most profound and one of the most, if not the most important anti-war film of Japanese cinema. And indeed, it has, I think, a really strong basis for that claim, because it is truly one of the most powerful anti-war films. And and Shinoda makes that case so effectively about how this is a type of allegory of human nature and about how it portrays people, human beings, who succumb to essentially doing or being tempted to do what might be called evil things. And what is the means by which this transformation occurs, this fall occurs? It can occur to anyone. I think that is the point, and that is the fear, and that is the tragedy that is lurking beneath the surface of a work like The Human Condition. And I think Shinoda presents that so well and so brilliantly. He recognizes that very much so. And he recognizes, again, to borrow the comparison with Renoir, the idea too that was alluded to earlier, which is the way in which class distinctions they disappear in favor of this humanistic viewpoint. And whether or not this humanistic viewpoint will succeed or fail in the context of the story, that becomes one of the central focus points of the work. And Shinoda does mention too about how this work, the human condition, does focus too on other people other than the Japanese wartime experience. I mean, this is of course expressed, for instance, very vividly in the first part regarding the prisoners in the Chinese laborer prisoners that are treated so harshly under the hands of the Kempeitai and the Japanese military, and indeed also even when they are quote-unquote handed over under the control of Kaji and the company, those harsh conditions still continue, as we know, for those who have seen part one. And so this becomes, I think, a very direct and important point, as Shinoda explained, in terms of the way in which Kobayashi's work is very much not just an anti-war film, or it is an anti-war film in many contexts, included in which is the strong and direct and pointed and sharp criticism of Japan and Japan's role in wartime. So this is, again, a very important point. This then leads, or this is part of Shinoda's discussion of each of the parts 1 and parts 2, again looking at it as a 6-part structure. And then he goes into a discussion of parts 3 and 4 about how this is turning into a film that is weaving in, according to Shinoda, anti-Stalinist messaging, and how this could be seen to be very complex from the viewpoints of filmmakers like Kobayashi, also like director of photography Miyajima. And Shinoda gives this great quote to sort of, he borrows the phrase, which is the idea of, "I doubt, therefore I am." And the idea of doubt is very significant in Kaji's story, and also in Kobayashi's story, and Gomikawa's story, and Miyajima's story, and others. And so this is such a great and astute comment and observation from Shinoda. And also the notion, as he goes into a discussion of the final parts 5 and 6, or the third part in the trilogy, is the notion of of Japan and a defeated Japan at the very end of the war, and also what happens to these people that are part of the wartime efforts in the face of defeat and also in the state of defeat, and how this film is about the state of defeat of Japan as a result of the war, from the viewpoint of viewers who are watching this work after the fact, after the end of the war. People like Shinoda and others. According to Shinoda, his experience was in this almost transcendental way. Watching this film, which is very bleak, very dark, very tragic, very sad, very intense indeed, very dark indeed, it is a work that also fills him with a great sense of encouragement. And this is Shinoda's words, and this is a very powerful way that he is describing his engagement with the human condition. In other words, the idea of experiencing something so intense and so shattering in terms of the real the horrors that are on display and the moral ambiguities that lead to these cause and effect consequences that have dire consequence to them. And still, this is a type of message. The underlying message is very strong and very much potent, and it's the engagement with this message that gives Shinoda, in his words, this idea of a great sense of encouragement. And that is a very overwhelmingly powerful way to view this. And it is in this and in other examples of this conversation that I think this conversation, or this one-on-one interview appreciation from Shinoda, is simply one of the best. Please check it out if you can. It is absolutely top-notch. So please check it out if you can. This is the discussion with Shinoda. Again, it's approximately 24 minutes from 2009. And then the disc 2 supplements is completed with the inclusion of the trailer, and it's another great trailer too, so please check it out if you can. So this is the state of the second disc, and so much like with the first disc, while it might seem on paper to have a very limited or low number of supplements in terms of the quantity, please rest assured, because the quality is very, very high indeed. We might not get any new supplements per se from the older DVD presentation, but that is okay, because what we still get is amazing. What we had in the earlier DVD release was amazing, and we have it carried over into this Blu-ray release, and so it is still amazing and so thought-provoking, and it's a great, almost it is a type of lovingly delivered lecture and talk and appreciation by the master, by one of the great masters of cinema, Shinoda, about another great master of cinema, Kobayashi, and one of the masterpieces from that master, which is The Human Condition. So please check it out if you can.